They were not trying to make a weapon. They were trying to live forever. That is the strange and almost poetic truth at the heart of one of the most consequential accidental discoveries in the entire history of the human race. The people who first stumbled upon the formula for gunpowder were not soldiers. They were not engineers designing weapons of war or strategists looking for new ways to destroy their enemies. They were Taoist alchemists, learned, serious, spiritually motivated men who spent their lives in quiet laboratories surrounded by furnaces and crucibles and hundreds of carefully labeled ingredients, mixing and heating and experimenting with one single consuming goal in mind. They wanted to find the elixir of immortality. They wanted to discover the perfect formula that would allow a human being to transcend the ordinary limits of flesh and time and live forever. They never found immortality, but in the process of searching for it, they accidentally discovered something that would kill more human beings than almost any other invention in history. The irony is so sharp it almost hurts. To understand how this happened, you need to understand who these alchemists were and what they believed. Taoism, the ancient Chinese philosophical and spiritual tradition that shaped so much of Chinese thought and culture across thousands of years, held among its many ideas a belief that the natural world was permeated by forces and substances that could, if properly understood and properly combined, produce effects far beyond what ordinary experience suggested was possible. The Taoist tradition of inner cultivation sought to refine and transform the human body and spirit through meditation, diet, breathing exercises, and the careful cultivation of vital energy. But there was also a tradition of external alchemy, Weidan, that sought transformation through the preparation and consumption of special elixirs made from carefully chosen and carefully processed natural substances. The most prized substances in this alchemical tradition were those associated with permanence and incorruptibility. Gold, which did not rust or decay, was considered particularly potent. It was the metal that time could not touch, and consuming it in some refined and properly prepared form was thought to transfer some of its immortal quality to the human body. Cinnabar, mercury sulfide, a beautiful deep red mineral, was another highly prized ingredient, associated in Chinese alchemical thought with life force and transformation. And sulfur, the yellow, pungent, combustible mineral that could be found near volcanic areas and hot springs, was also a significant ingredient in many alchemical formulas, associated with fire and transformation and the deep heat of the earth. It was the combination of sulfur with other common alchemical ingredients that led, sometime around the 9th century AD during the Tang dynasty, to a discovery that the alchemists who made it immediately recognized as dangerous, alarming, and not at all what they had been looking for. The precise moment of discovery cannot be pinpointed with certainty. History does not always preserve the exact day that everything changes. But the earliest known written reference to what would become gunpowder appears in a Chinese alchemical text called the Zhenyuan Miaodao Yaolu, written sometime around 850 AD. The text does not celebrate the discovery. It warns against it. It describes what happened when careless alchemists combined sulfur, charcoal, and a substance called saltpeter, potassium nitrate, a white crystalline compound that forms naturally in certain soils and was commonly used in Chinese alchemy and medicine, and heated the mixture or brought it near a flame. The result, the text records with evident alarm, was a sudden and violent fire. The mixture did not burn the way ordinary materials burned. Slowly, controllably, in a way that could be managed with a little care. It erupted. It flared with terrifying speed and intensity. It burned hands and faces. It scorched beards. It burned down the houses where experiments were being conducted. It was, the text makes clear, something genuinely dangerous, something to be approached with great caution or, better yet, avoided entirely. The alchemists were not pleased with what they had found. They were looking for something that would extend life. They had found something that ended it. They put their warnings in their texts and presumably went back to searching for immortality by other means. But the formula was written down now. And written things have a way of spreading, regardless of the warnings attached to them. The substance that the Tang dynasty alchemists had accidentally created was, of course, black powder, the specific mixture of potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur that we call gunpowder. The chemistry of why it works the way it does was not understood by anyone for many centuries after its discovery, but the underlying principle is elegantly simple. Potassium nitrate is an oxidizer. It releases oxygen when it decomposes. Sulfur and charcoal are fuels. When the mixture is ignited, the potassium nitrate releases oxygen that feeds the combustion of the sulfur and charcoal simultaneously from within the mixture itself, rather than requiring oxygen from the surrounding air. This is why gunpowder burns so much faster and more intensely than ordinary fuels. It carries its own oxygen supply within it, making the combustion reaction essentially self-sustaining and almost instantaneous. The result is a rapid release of hot gas that, if confined in a tube or a container, generates an explosive pressure that can propel objects with tremendous force. None of this was understood in 9th century China. But what was understood, quickly and with great practical clarity, was that this substance was powerful, controllable in the right hands, and potentially very useful in the one arena of human activity where powerful and controllable things are always in demand: war. The Chinese military was among the first to recognize the potential of gunpowder as a weapon, and the development of military gunpowder technology in China across the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries is one of the most remarkable stories of rapid technological innovation in pre-modern history. The first military applications were incendiary. Gunpowder was used to make fire weapons that burned with an intensity and a persistence that ordinary fire weapons could not match. Fire arrows with gunpowder-soaked tips that burned even when wet. Firebombs, ceramic or metal containers filled with gunpowder and incendiary materials, hurled by siege engines, that exploded on impact and spread burning material across a wide area. Fire lances, bamboo or metal tubes filled with gunpowder that produced a sustained jet of flame when ignited, essentially a primitive flamethrower that could be carried by a single soldier. These early gunpowder weapons were terrifying and effective, and they gave Chinese military forces a significant advantage in the many wars and conflicts of the period. But Chinese military engineers were not content with fire alone. They were already thinking about the other property of gunpowder, the explosive force, the sudden violent pressure produced when the burning mixture was confined in an enclosed space. If you could harness that pressure, direct it, control it, then you had something far more powerful than a fire weapon. You had a machine that could throw things with a force that no human arm, no tension-powered catapult, no existing weapon technology could match. The first step toward the gun was the fire lance, the tube that directed the blast of burning gunpowder in one direction. Chinese engineers noticed that fire lances could be made to project not just flame but shrapnel, pieces of metal, fragments of ceramic, sharp debris packed into the tube along with the gunpowder charge. The shrapnel was driven outward by the expanding gas of the burning powder with enough force to wound or kill at close range. This is the principle of the gun in its earliest, crudest form: a tube, a propellant, a projectile. The fire lance of the 10th and 11th centuries was not yet a gun in the form that we would recognize. But it was the direct ancestor of every gun ever made. The evolution from fire lance to true gun, a device firing a single dense projectile through a metal barrel, happened in China over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries. The earliest surviving metal gun barrel dates from 1288, recovered from a site in Inner Mongolia. It is a small bronze tube, clearly designed to fire a projectile using gunpowder propellant, and it is the physical ancestor of every firearm in history. By the time this gun was made, gunpowder technology had already been spreading westward for over a century, carried along the Silk Road trade routes by merchants and travelers and soldiers, transmitted through the Islamic world by scholars and military engineers who encountered Chinese gunpowder weapons in the course of the vast and complex interactions between Chinese, Central Asian, and Islamic civilizations that defined the medieval Eurasian world. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, the most explosive military expansion in pre-modern history, which swept from China across Central Asia and Persia and into Eastern Europe in the space of a few decades, played a critical role in spreading gunpowder technology across the Eurasian landmass. The Mongols used gunpowder weapons in their campaigns, encountered and absorbed the military technologies of every civilization they conquered, and carried knowledge of gunpowder westward in their armies in ways that accelerated its transmission beyond what trade alone would have achieved. By the time the Mongol storm had passed, knowledge of gunpowder had reached the Islamic world thoroughly and was beginning to penetrate Europe. In Europe, the encounter with gunpowder happened at a historically precise and enormously consequential moment. European military technology and social organization in the High Middle Ages were built around a particular set of foundations: the armored knight on horseback, the stone castle, the crossbow, and the longbow, that represented centuries of accumulated investment and institutional development. The feudal system itself was partly organized around the military function of the mounted knight. Castles were the physical infrastructure of political power. Whoever controlled the strongest walls controlled the territory. The entire social and political architecture of medieval Europe was built, in part, around the military realities of the pre-gunpowder world. Gunpowder did not simply add a new weapon to this existing system. Over time, and it took time, because the process was gradual and uneven and complicated by the slow improvement of gunpowder formulas and weapon designs, it undermined the foundations of the entire system. The cannon changed the castle from an impregnable stronghold into a vulnerable target. The great stone walls that had protected feudal lords from their enemies for centuries crumbled under artillery bombardment in years rather than withstanding sieges that had previously lasted for months or decades. The armored knight, who had dominated European battlefields for centuries and whose training and equipment represented an enormous investment of wealth and time, became increasingly irrelevant as firearms improved and the cost of equipping and deploying effective infantry forces fell. The social consequences were enormous and far-reaching. The monopoly on military force that the feudal aristocracy had maintained through their control of expensive armored cavalry and fortified castles was eroded by the democratizing force of gunpowder weapons, which allowed a trained soldier with a firearm to kill a knight in full armor with equipment that cost a small fraction of the price of horse and armor and years of martial training. The political centralization of European states was accelerated by gunpowder, because the enormous expense of producing and deploying effective artillery was beyond the means of individual feudal lords and could only be sustained by centralized states with the tax revenue and administrative apparatus to organize large-scale military production. The gun helped kill the medieval world and midwife the modern nation-state. Beyond Europe, the consequences of gunpowder technology spread across every inhabited continent as European maritime expansion, itself partly made possible by navigational technologies like the compass, brought European ships carrying European cannons into contact with civilizations and peoples who had not independently developed gunpowder weapons. The asymmetry of military technology that resulted shaped the history of colonialism, conquest, and the brutal reshaping of the global distribution of power across the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in ways whose consequences are still felt everywhere in the world today. And through all of this, through the wars and the conquests and the revolutions and the empires and the centuries of violence that gunpowder both enabled and shaped, the original alchemists of Tang Dynasty China had been looking for something else entirely. They were sitting in their quiet laboratories surrounded by their crucibles and their ingredients, carefully measuring sulfur and saltpeter and charcoal by the light of oil lamps, writing down their warnings about the dangerous mixture they had accidentally created, and hoping that somewhere in the next combination or the one after that they would find what they were really looking for. They never found immortality. No one has, yet. But they found something that proved, in ways they could never have imagined, to be a different kind of immortality. Not the immortality of the body they were seeking, but the immortality of an idea. A formula written in a text. A discovery passed from hand to hand, culture to culture, century to century, changing shape as it traveled but never disappearing, never being unlearned, never being uninvented. Once the formula existed, it existed forever. 3 ingredients: sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, mixed in the right proportions and brought near a flame. 9 centuries of history have flowed from that moment in a Tang Dynasty laboratory. Every war fought with firearms. Every building demolished with explosives. Every firework that has ever lit up a night sky. Every mine blasted open. Every mountain tunneled through. Every great engineering project made possible by controlled explosive force. Every rocket that has ever left the Earth's atmosphere. All of it traces back to the same place, a quiet alchemical laboratory in 9th century China, a mixture that was never supposed to catch fire, and a group of men who were looking for a way to live forever and found, instead, something that would change the way everyone else lived, fought, died, built, and moved through the world for the next 1,000 years and beyond. They were not trying to make a weapon. They were trying to live forever. And the world they accidentally made is the one we are still living in today.